I'm Abby. I'm assistant producer and content manager here at DreadXP.
Hey, my name is Ted. I am the founder and head of productions for DreadXP.
So my first question is about the games, like the initial inspiration behind Mortuary Assistant and then Delusion.
I can actually speak to Delusion first. So, Dread Delusion kind of came from this place where we really wanted to create a game that was kind of in that vein of Morrowind, like one of those older style RPGs, but that had like significantly simplified mechanics. We feel that like a lot of times with RPGs, like especially modern, like, the kind of the old dichotomy would be like Bethesda versus BioWare RPGs, where BioWare RPGs were like more on rails and Bethesda RPGs were more like open world. We wanted to do something that was more like a Bethesda RPG, but that like wasn't so onerous on like grind or on like, because has anyone ever finished Skyrim? Like, is there a single person that's ever finished it? I think we all get to like High Hrothgar and then we're like, well, that was a lot of walking. And then we like get lost in Falkreath or something like that. And like, okay, now like, and then we never finish it, right? And so we wanted to make an RPG that was like scaled to a place where like, it was still awesome to explore, but also more like manageable. And then also on top of that, we really liked the PS1, PSX aesthetics, partially because it allows us to go with a very emotive kind of art direction and style without like blowing the budget. Because keep in mind, Delusion, the main developer on it is just like one guy doing like the whole thing. And, but also it allows you to kind of harken back to this era where games were a little bit more about exploration and like finding collectibles. If you think about like Spyro the Dragon or something, those like kind of cutesy little like spinning orbs that you had to find that just don't really work with like modern realistic graphics. Or, we haven't really found a way to make them work with modern realistic graphics, I would say. I don't want to say, no one can make it work. But so Delusion, we wanted to kind of hone in on that idea of exploration and then being able to deliver this kind of melancholic world with, undead spirits and this kind of empire in decay and have this kind of subtle horror to it, like more of like Gothic style horror rather than, blood and guts or anything like that, although there's plenty of that in the game. So it really just kind of, it was all these elements that kind of congealed together. You can see inspirations of like Warhammer in there with like kind of these skeletal mech things in like the Clockwork City. And yeah, so that was really the inspiration behind Delusion. With the Mortuary Assistant, the goal was to make the scariest game possible in a kind of condensed area. I think that a lot of people with the Mortuary Assistant don't really realize it takes place almost entirely in just like one small location. It's just this mortuary, I think it's like 5-6 rooms. But really, Brian, the guy that is the lead programmer on the Mortuary Assistant, he comes from AAA. He, used to be like he was like the lead producer on like ArcAge and like a couple MMOs and things like that. And he really wanted to try to like apply his skills, the maximum of capacity of skills in a scale that would allow him to really make them shine. And it's honestly, when I saw it, because we acquired as publishers for the Mortuary Assistant a little bit later into its life cycle. When I saw it, I was like, yes, this is exactly what horror needs. So many times, big industry people think that you need to like go bigger and bigger with every game. That like that's like the logic is that like everything should be bigger, and then it eventually gets to a point where it can't sustain the feel and the vibe of the game, and then it kind of sucks. And with the Mortuary Assistant, it's like exactly what I think is what's needed in horror. Smaller games with tighter concepts and tighter scares, like that kind of really, really distilled experience. And the Mortuary Assistant's just perfect for that.
So how long has each one been in development? And I know that you mentioned with Delusion, it's just a single solo developer. Can you talk a bit more about that and if there's been any like challenges for him in terms of developing it by himself?
So Delusion is actually the first project we signed. And when we first picked it up, there was an alpha for it in one of the Haunted PS1 demo discs, which is kind of this free thing that they do. And we had worked with James twice before on 2 of the DreadX collections, our previous titles. So in terms of like how long it's been in development, that's like kind of a weird question because he was working on it kind of on and off before we picked it up. But in full development, probably a little over a year, let me think, like a little over a year and a half now. Development issues, yeah, it turns out it's really hard for one guy to make Morrowind by himself. The cool thing is that with a lot of the pipelines and stuff like that, it's easier to develop things than it used to be, especially when there's like a lot of tools that can help you with, visuals and, a lot of that kind of stuff. But honestly, I think probably the biggest thing that's the issue with Dread Delusion is that there's so much that we can do in the game and we want to do, that trying to narrow down exactly what's actually going to work has been really hard, because, you know, it doesn't take him a terribly long time to put new things into the game, but then to test them, and then in this big open world environment, it's like, does this really fit and does this work? And then what do we cut? And then how do we replace it? You know, that is a much bigger question. That's really, you know, a lot of our expansion of as a publisher with Dread XP has been trying to like build up ourselves so we can have the services to provide to these devs in terms of like QA and testing and, you know, art asset contribution and things like that, you know, trailers. The problem with the kinds of games that we make is that like none of the games that we make are like a corporate idea of like what a game should be, right? Like when we don't start with like the business side, like every single game that we publish is like, I want to make someone's dream come true. Like when we fund a solo developer, right? Like if you give a solo developer like $100,000, if you give, you know, Infinity Ward $100,000, that doesn't do anything, right? That pays like one CEO's Christmas bonus. But if you give a single guy that's making a really cool idea $100,000, that like legitimately changes his life. And so the challenge for us is, how do we make a product that we can get over the finish line and market while still maintaining that ethos of making someone's dreams come true? And that was probably the hardest thing for us, is that like, you know, every cut isn't like a cut because, oh, you know, the market analysis says that this character isn't swag enough, or whatever the fuck they say in market analysis meetings. It's that like every cut is like, oh, this was part of my like dream, and it's like, it's just not working though, and that's the hard conversation. And then for Mortuary Assistant, Abby, you're kind of been a lot more involved in that one. So do you want to talk about the development history of that?
That one's a little harder because, you know, we did come in like later in development. So like as far as like specific development things that would make that challenging, I would say that's more of a Brian question. What I will say is that he is a solo developer though, and that alone is challenging enough. You know, we've had a lot of, there is like a lot of history with the Mortuary Assistant, and it's come a long way. So there was a teaser, and before the teaser, there was like an alpha build. And, you know, if you go back to that original build and you see like what it looks like now, it's just crazy the amount of progress and the amount of time that it's been done in. You know, there's just so much added throughout the process, and you know, Brian's just a great developer and he's always on top of things, and it's just crazy to see. He makes all that hard work look effortless, essentially. It's crazy. Like, I'm just like, this is the developer I want to be one day. It's ridiculous. He's just so good. But you know, he like Ted said before, he came from AAA, so you know, he understands the challenge, and you know, it's really cool to see all the progress, because again, if you go back to that original alpha, it's like night and day. You can kind of tell there's like those ideas still there. They kind of develop over time.
And just a note real quick, probably when we've talked to Brian, the thing that we've been trying to hone on the most is the ability to have this kind of persistent task, which is the mortuary stuff, like doing the body preparation stuff, while introducing the scares and the investigation mechanics and like need to go to the places, which has like, so also the scare system is dynamic. Like you will never play twice and have the same scares. So trying to make it so that the player is like correctly focused on like where those scares are going to be, so they don't miss them, so that like it all works. That's been a lot of stuff that we've been kind of like hashing out in testing and such.
And on top of that, you know, he like thinks of everything. So if you try to go and leave the mortuary, like it's like, okay, what's going to happen then, right? There's like all these things that, you know, your average player doesn't consider. You know, seeing like, they don't consider that they're actually going to see another option in the story if they do choose. Why don't I just leave? It's like Brian thought of all those things, so it's very interesting.
So the next question I have is about like the horror elements in each game, because I know that you guys are bringing up the scares, especially with Mortuary Assistant being very scary. Like, what kind of like settings or atmosphere, or what kind of helps add to those scares in these games?
Honestly, what's really special about the Mortuary Assistant is the fact that, you know, Ted had mentioned before, like the surface area is so small. And what I think that a lot of horror games don't do that the Mortuary Assistant does really well is background spooks. It's very tasteful. Like, yes, there are things that are in your face, and yes, you have the brutality and the blood and guts. But what really makes the Mortuary Assistant scary, at least for me, is you see something quickly, you're like, did I see it? And like, it's just there's so many background spooks, and the actual sound design as well. Those are the two things that I always recommend to horror devs, is have really good sound design and do background spooks, please. Like, once your like creature or your spooks are in your face, like, it only takes a couple times before it's like whatever. It's like you're desensitized to it. But like, background spooks, and they're randomly generated too, so it's like you get a new one and you don't expect it. So it's just crazy the amount of background spooks in there, and it really adds to the overall atmosphere in general.
Yeah, and as for Dread Delusion, it's kind of interesting because I think that people, when they think horror, like, there's a very specific kind of horror that they think of in their head, like either a slasher film or Alien or something. But it's interesting because, like, even if you think about like the horror genre, like a film like The Exorcist and a film like Scream have like basically nothing in common, except for the fact that you can find them at the same shelf at I'm gonna date myself here, but Blockbuster. Like, I think that a lot of our ideas of like what the genre is from pre-existing properties. But I think that, like, for me, like, the inspiration behind some of the horror in Dread Delusion is like something like Disco Elysium, where like there's a world that has gotten to this state that is so like fundamentally fucked that like it seems normal to everyone else. And as an outside observer, you're like, hey, this is like kind of fucked up. Observer is a good example. I always like the level in Observer where there's like the pig that's like growing all the organs. And like, it's like, do you want to disconnect this pig or not, and like kill it and stuff? But like the thing that's always like kind of struck me about that segment is that like the character of the Observer guy, Dan Lazarski, he wouldn't have a problem with that. It's us as the player that has a problem with that. And that, to me, is like a specific kind of horror where you can peer into a world that is like fundamentally flawed or fucked up, and you as the player experience that dissonance, right? Like, as opposed to being like the character in the game being like, oh my God, how did it, like, And I think that there's something like kind of profound to that, and kind of deeper and more disturbing than you can get with just jump scares. So with Dread Delusion, I would say that the horror is certainly more thematic. I mean, there's scary elements in the game. There's like Cthulhu monsters and stuff, but like in a way that they are as part of the world as the guy that's running the tavern. And it's us that kind of finds that kind of strange and terrifying. So
I also wanted to ask about a little bit more about the visual aesthetic, because I know that you mentioned briefly about some of the like PSX kind of inspirations for Dread Delusion, and then visually as well, the Mortuary Assistant has kind of like because it is such a small enclosed space, like there's a lot of like detail in like the room design and like the things that you can do as well. So I was kind of wanted to ask about like visual aesthetic and direction, kind of bringing that all together.
Dread Delusion, the visual aesthetic, we wanted to go for something that was both grand in the world design, that there's always something over there that you want to explore, that you want to look at. There's like this kind of the space dragon flying around. There's this like, airship with these spotlights kind of going around. We wanted to kind of focus on that grand sense of discovery rather than any of the specific minutia, mostly because I feel that trying to focus on just like a ton of minutia is something that like you're not gonna like be able to do if you're one guy trying to make Morrowind, right? Like, and even if you look at the dungeons in something like Skyrim, which I hate to break it to all of our fans out there, but Skyrim did have a higher budget than Dread Delusion by a little bit. But like, even if you go in there, like a lot of the dungeons, they're going to be like a lot of repeated textures and things like that, but they always try to add something to like give it a little bit of flavor. And that's kind of what we're trying to go for, is like, regardless of where you go, there's going to be something there that gives a little bit of flavor. And I think that really one of the big visual things about Dread Delusion that's really hard to tell from the trailers, and is going to be hard to tell until you play the game, is that like a lot of the world is meant to be observed from that grander scale. So like, for example, if you walk into a building, right, and you see that there's like this corridor going off of the building, but you don't see a doorway for it inside, that's because there's something in that building that you can interact with that will then open up that corridor. So instead of having it be like, oh, there's these little details of like, I noticed this painting had a different color eyes, Instead, you're supposed to like kind of look at the grand scale and then figure out that there's something inside that you can interact with. It'll be like a candlestick or something. Your lore skill will help you find it. But also at the same time, a lot of the buildings have to serve a dual purpose, because there's an illusion mechanic in the game where like a lot of the buildings, like you'll walk into a granary and there's nothing there. But then if you cast a potion of true sight, or cast a spell of true sight, or drink a potion of true sight, you'll then notice it's actually like a big witch's tower and there's like a bunch of witches inside. And that has made it so that a lot of our design, has to be dual purpose, because a lot of those like individual minute details, like they're not going to one-for-one transfer, but like the big building design, you can flip that over. So we've kind of focused a lot more on the grand scale stuff. And then also just having monsters that like kind of look expressive and cool in that very kind of PSX way. Like I said, it's more about the grand design than the individual textures. It's more about creating this sense of a world. But obviously that's very different for Mortuary Assistant. So Abby, you can talk about that.
Yeah, we go from fantasy to like kind of like more realistic, like a more realistic environment. So something about the Mortuary Assistant is that like there's nothing in the environments, in like the main environment, I should say, that isn't it's supposed to be there, right? And like if you were to go there to, do your thing, like all the stuff that's there, like it has a purpose. There's not a lot of like extra stuff in the environments that are like, what's this doing here? This doesn't fit here. And it's actually a comment that Brian has gotten quite a bit, is like from morticians, like real life morticians, is true to the realistic process of things, which is cool, because it surrounds in the actual story, there's a lot of trauma involved. And that's when you start to see like those otherworldly things. But as it's currently presented, like when you first walk in, your apartments, everything looks like it would be in an apartment. If in the actual, lab, like everything looks like it should be there. And then you slowly start to uncover things that aren't supposed to be there. And as far as like visuals go, there is like a lot of effort on those characters, and a lot of like the brutal scenes that you see and the brutal environments that you get tossed into, surrounding trauma. So it definitely takes a more like realistic approach, and then slowly gets kind of fucked up as you go through the story.
That actually leads into my next question, which is about kind of the story and the background for each game, like the setting and the world, and like how the player like gets introduced to these concepts.
Dread Delusion is like, so I'm helping write some of the backstory for it, and so it's like a big passion of mine. It's, the world of Dread Delusion is the state that it's in now is like the result of like thousands of years of development and disaster. This kind of cycle of boom and bust that's led to people having to flee the world below onto these floating islands. And there's these gods that have kind of waxed and waned over the years and then splintered into new gods. And so it kind of has this American Gods vibe of like the gods are what we believe in, and then they gain power. But then there's also this element where like you will be able to tap into this power in a way. I don't want to like reveal too much because I don't want to spoil anything with the main storyline. But essentially, it's a world where belief is made manifest. And you as a person find a way to, in a way, manifest belief in yourself. I don't want to sound like a Care Bear, but I mean, like, if you think about like experience points and quests, like what are those? Like those represent your skills getting better. But in Dread Delusion, there's also this element of that people start believing in you more as a person. And so, we wanted to kind of implement a lot of that that sense of, like the skill points in the game are called delusions. And so as people believe in you more, you will also kind of believe in yourself more. So there's kind of two sides to it. And that is kind of how you gain your strength. But then also there's like all these gods that you'll meet, and this kind of conflict going on within the world. It's definitely lore heavy, but we wanted to kind of like reduce the amount of lore that's just kind of like thrown in your face. And so a lot of that is like in books that you have to discover. So like there's a huge portion of the lore, like 80% of the backstory and stuff like that most players will probably never discover, because you have to really dive deep into like the texts in the game to like kind of get to it. And so this weird outpost that I found that looks like all mechanical, like, there's more to it than it's just a cool mechanical little outpost and stuff like that. So yeah, Dread Delusion is definitely, if you're into games where you can explore and uncover a ton about this world, but it's not like you have to take a correspondence course. It's not like trying to jump into Warhammer, where it's like, okay, what's a space marine? Okay, what's a chapter master? What's a chaplain? Who's the emperor? What? Like you have to dedicate a month to learning Warhammer lore before you try to tackle into Warhammer. We wanted to do something that was far more accessible, but still had that same level of depth. So yeah.
And for the mortuary assistant, you know, basically, I don't want to give too much away because that's like that's one of the really cool parts of Mortuary, but essentially you're playing as a woman who late at night she gets called in to, you know, perform embalmings, and you know, upon getting there she finds out that she is locked in there, and gets a phone call from the lead mortician pretty much saying like, hey, like what's happening is going to sound crazy and it's not going to make sense, but I just need you to do your job. And that's how you know there's like some sort of like demonic paranormal thing starting to come in. But as she does these embalmings, it's also uncovered that there's a much deeper plot, and that it's also connecting back to like some trauma and history that she has. And that's when you involve some of those otherworldly environments and such. And so as you go through the game, you start to uncover like, what is the story behind like why I'm here and why I have to do these embalmings. And then also like you uncover like the background story of this character that you're playing as, and the various characters that are involved in that, which leads to a variety of different endings.
Real quick too, I want to just really quickly mention that I think this is important a lot because of a lot of the discussion around horror. The way that the game is set up is that it's not that the demon is a metaphor for trauma. It's that there is a reason that the demon is targeting her specifically. So it's more like a classic possession story rather than like a Silent Hill, like it's all in her head story.
And that actually also leads me into my next question about some of the horror influences for these games, because I know that you guys are both big into horror. So I just kind of wanted to know, like background wise, like has there been any kind of horror inspirations or things that have inspired parts of these games at all?
I think that, I mean, you're kind of touching on a larger question about like the studio in general. Like Dread XP is not your typical publisher where we're just like throwing money at projects that we think are gonna like make a return. Like I'm like a lifelong horror fan, and horror like means a lot to me specifically. Like I grew up really sick. Horror was always like, ironically in a way, like a refuge for me. Cause like when you're a kid that grows up sick, you grow up around death. And you grow a kind of gallows humor that like other children can't understand. No, nor should they. Like, you know, most people aren't exposed to that. And that's like not a fault. That's how it should be. And you kind of have to grow up feeling that you're strange in a way. Horror for me was where I didn't feel strange. And it was always something that like, I knew instinctively as a young kid that like, I could connect with it in a way that those around me weren't. And so originally it was like, oh, I felt special because I could watch these horror movies and I liked them and that was quirky. But then I realized kind of as I grew in my emotional maturity that like, it was less that I felt special because I get it when others don't, like in a gatekeepy way, but more that I felt like I wasn't alone. That there were other people out there that like thought like me, that felt like me. So when you're talking about like the styles of horror, you know, it really is a question of what it is that we have decided to like pursue to publish and fund and things like that. And to me, horror is not about trying to put down barriers of this isn't horror. I used to kind of be of the mindset that everything can be horror, but it is not. You know, obviously there must be things that are horror in order for things to not be horror. You know, exactly, or vice versa. When I think about the kinds of horror that I want to put out there, I always try to put myself into the shoes of like those people that I don't have the same idea of horror as, because it's easy for me to like, I'm really scared of ghosts. Not like in real life. I don't believe in ghosts in real life, but I love supernatural horror movies. I'm not into slashers. They just don't scare me. But if I'm going to take this view of horror that like it is a way, like if I'm going to have that emotional connection to horror, I have to realize that other people have a different avenue of having that emotional connection to horror. So we here at Dread XP, we try to take a very, very kind of broad view of horror, to not just try to make one specific type of horror, but to try to make the type of horror that would appeal to a lot of different people. So Sucker for Love, which is one of our games that just came out recently, you know, it's like an eldritch dating simulator, but it's also a horror game. And if you really play it, you're like, oh wow, there's like things in here that are like really disturbing and fucked up. But it engages with a style of horror that is very unexpected. And you know, and then on the other hand, you have something like My Friendly Neighborhood, which is a game that is kind of more of the what I would call like young adult horror, with the puppets and the scary puppets and things like that. But that came from a genuine place to not want to make a game like John, the guy that's making it, wasn't like, I want to make a Poppy's Playtime. Like that's not where it came from. It came from the fact that like he wanted to make a game that was scary, but that you weren't also killing things in, that you wanted to like actually help. Like it came from a very, you know, genuine, unique place because he's a very sweet guy. So the horror, you know, we don't have a checklist of this is the horror that has to be in the game. It's more of a gut feel for us. And we wanted to promote all the brands of horror, all the styles of horror. And it does make marketing a little bit more difficult. And it does make, you know, our messaging kind of all over the place at times. But you always got to be aware of how your actions are affecting the world, right? Like, and if we were just promoting one type of horror, then we would basically be what's the word I'm looking for? Diminishing or trying to inherently say that the other types of horror aren't real horror. And so I always just kind of find it like a personal thing for me that I always want to try to promote, even the horror that's not the horror that I necessarily look at. So, you know, that is kind of the for me, when we're talking about, you know, the kind of scares that we as a company have decided to create and promote and all these different things. It's whatever I think not could scare someone, but I have to listen a lot to what scares other people and then try to make decisions for them rather than just always what I think is scary. So Abby, do you have anything to add to that? I rambled a little bit there, which I have a bad tendency to do.
I mean, I think you covered like the messaging pretty well. You know, like biggest thing is like horror is super subjective. And it's one of the reasons why making the DreadX collections are so fun. It's because we get like a nice variety of horror. You know, it's like a sampler platter, and you know, one thing that scares you is not going to scare me, and vice versa. And honestly, for me personally, like I don't go after like all the time like what scares me, does that make it horror or not. It's more of like something that is like deeper and darker in some way, shape, or form, if that makes sense.
So my last few questions are about first the games, like the release date and where people can go to learn more information about each game. And then the other part of the question is about Dread XP as a whole and what you guys kind of want people to know about Dread XP.
So Dread Delusion, people are going to be able to get their hands on it pretty soon. If they want to learn more, you can always go to our website. Always follow the main developer on Twitter, the lovely Hellplace. He's always posting new screenshots from it. But really, in terms of like the lore and stuff, we kind of decided not to do like a full website with like a lore Bible and stuff because we wanted it to be kind of like discovered in game. What I would say is, you know, check the Steam page, and like by the time this interview goes live, like it's not going to be very far off that people can get their hands in it. So in terms of Mortuary Assistant, we're shooting for July, kind of middle to the end of July. We're actually just finishing up the last couple details on it right now, but it should be coming out in July. And you know, all of them are going to be PC first, but they're all planning on being ported to consoles. So you should be able to get them on any system probably by the end of the year. I don't want to go too hard on that, but you know, from our projections, we'll probably be able to get it on consoles later this year. And then what I want people to know about Dread XP as a publisher, you know, we're a lot more involved than the average publisher. We do weekly meetings with all the devs. We contribute a lot to the development, you know, in terms of design decisions. What I would say is that like we're never going to be the company that comes in and says you have to do this, you have to do that. Like that's not really what we're about. But like 2 years ago, I was a journalist. Like I wasn't a producer, and COVID happened, and basically it was like everyone I knew that was an indie developer was losing their day jobs, because unfortunate thing about being an indie is you usually have to have a day job, and people didn't know how they were going to make rent. So I created the DreadX collection, the first one, as a way for people to make rent. Work on this for a week, get $1,000 just for your week of work, split of the profits, boom, make something cool that I thought was like, I've always been like, oh, I think that horror games can be made shorter. And you look at Five Nights at Freddy's and it's like, you don't need to put 2 years into this. Like, and you know, you could make a project that is cool with a bunch of indie devs without everyone working on it for like, you know, a year or so. So I wanted to create something that was fun for fans, something unique. We could get all these little unique experiences. But really, it was like, let's pay some out-of-work devs. That's kind of the ethos that I've grown DreadXP from. Is like, I didn't really get into this to like try to milk a market. Like, I didn't do market analysis and was like, horror is the best way for profit to this cost ratio. Like, I'm just a guy that really likes horror and wanted to make a place where people could make horror that wasn't just trying to chase trends. We're a small team. Like, every single person that works for me is a horror either developer or like longtime fanatic. I mean, Abby here, who's my assistant producer, worked on a couple of the collections before she was a producer. She makes games, like she's a developer. And, you know, my social media guy, a guy named Jans, like he was a, you know, big horror fan. Like, I didn't go to a marketing agency and say, hey, get me someone that can market this. Like, I just found someone that loved it and wanted to do it. Like, every single person in the company all started like either as a writer or as a developer on a project that then like worked their way up. And it's like, we have a company structure that's very like, if you want to do something, if you want a role, then go for it. Like, and you know, we give people the chance to succeed. It's the same internally as it is with our games. Like, we're funding the projects that are one-man teams, two-man teams, things that like a bigger publisher wouldn't really be looking at. And we're doing it in a way that is very like developer focused. It's like fan focused. Like, there's a lot of publishers out there that just pick up all the indie titles that they can and churn them out, and then they hope that one lands. And like, you know, to me, when one of our titles doesn't like meet our budget expectations, it like crushes me. Not because of like the money, but because like that's someone's dream. And so every single game that we come out with is a passion project. Every single product is someone's dream game. Every single thing we do, there's a heart to it that we can't fake, because I'm not a good enough liar to fake it. Like, I wish I was a better liar. I'd probably sell more video games, but I can't. Like, and there's too many people I talk to every day, so I can't keep my lies straight. So I just try to tell the truth. And the truth is that if you were to stop me and ask me about any one of our games, I'd be able to talk about it with the same level of passion and intensity, because I love everything that we do. And that's our whole team does. Like, and and we're going to keep doing it. We're going to keep trying to deliver unique horror from places people don't expect, that's going to give people what they want, even if it's not what they expected they wanted. So, you know, and that's what we're here to do.